as well as looking at some special wetlands, including Dyke Marsh a little bit. I know you people probably know more about it than I do. And then also I will tell you a bit about our center at the end of the talk. So without further ado, I'm going to share my screen. And let's see, first I've got to make sure I have the right thing up to share. Okay, there we go. So you should have a PowerPoint coming up right now. Does everybody see the PowerPoint? In fact, I can probably make it full screen, and that will make it better. Let me see if my page down is going to work, right? Yep. Okay. All right. So I am really, as was noted, I'm a freshwater ecologist. I tend to study more open water systems, but I do get into the SAV beds, and I'm also of course interested in wetlands. So this gave me a chance to actually refresh myself on some of the issues of wetlands. Okay, so as many of you know, what we have to define a wetland, and wetlands are lands where saturation with water is the dominant factor determining the nature of soil development and the types of plant and animal communities living in the soil. And the substrate is at least periodically covered or saturated with water. So they're on the margin, on the transition between open water and terrestrial systems. And sometimes there's not even open water around them. They are contained in a basin that allows the key element is the saturation with water of the soil causes the soil to go anaerobic, and this is stressful for many plants. So plants that can make it in a wetland are very distinctive. And so this creates severe physiological problems for all plants and animals, except those that are adapted for life in water or in saturated soil. Okay, so wetlands must have one or more of the following three attributes. At least periodically, the land supports predominantly hydric plants. Let's see, I went full screen, but I didn't go, I think I'll just stick with this though. Let me reduce this thing over here. You don't need that. Okay, at least periodically the land supports predominantly hydrophytes. Hydrophytes are plants that are adapted to water saturated soils. So if we have the certain kinds of plants, we can be pretty sure it's a wetland. We can check the soils, and if they have certain characteristics, often black coloration from chemicals that are reduced state, which is what happens when there's no oxygen. And the substrate is saturated with water or covered by shallow water sometime during the growing season. Okay, so there's a couple of different classifications of wetlands. The one that is probably most well known is the Cowardin et al. Classification, which is used by Fish and Wildlife Service, and they have mapped all the wetlands in the United States using aerial photography, and they have parsed those different areas into these different categories. And the main categories are marine estuarine, then riverine, lacustrine, and palustrine. So some of those names are easy to parse, like marine estuarine. Riverine have to have some reference to flowing water. It could be tidal, it could be perennial flowing water, or it could be intermittent flowing water. Lacustrine stands for lakes, so they would be along the margins of lakes normally. And palustrine are somewhat isolated. They are wetlands that are not tied directly to open water. Now, another classification that came along a bit later was the hydrogeomorphic classification. And this places less emphasis on vegetation. The previous classification I was just talking about, the Cowardin, places a lot of emphasis on vegetation because that's what you can remotely sense, the type of vegetation. But it doesn't tell you as much about function. Whereas the hydrogeomorphic classification tells you more about function. It looks at hydrodynamic characteristics. Where does the water come from? What type of water is flowing in? What's the output of water? And then the geomorphic setting, which could be a depression, could be riverine, fringe. Those are occurring again. And it has been used directed at understanding wetland functioning. And functioning we can define as what wetlands do, like maybe they remove nitrate from water, or maybe they store water. And then value is how much this functioning is worth to society. So sometimes we have to discriminate those two things. Okay, so what are some of the functions and values of wetlands? Let's see. I'm not going to mess with it. Some things are hydrologic stability. So they store water, they provide groundwater recharge, they mitigate floods. They can provide a buffering of erosion shorelines to control erosion. They can remove sediments from water that flows in or flows by, and also remove nutrients from water. And they've been used, artificial wetlands or constructed wetlands have been used as part of sewage treatment to remove nutrients. They're very important at carbon storage and climate change mitigation. So a very, very large store of carbon is in peat bogs in the colder climates of the north, particularly the northern hemisphere. It is a very large carbon store in those particular wetlands. And there's other wetlands, many other wetlands also store carbon in the form of both vegetation and partially decomposed organic matter. So they're very important then in sequestering carbon and helping to mitigate climate change. They also provide fish and wildlife habitat and nutrition and recreation and aesthetics for people. What are some of the threats to wetlands? And when I get come later to the sample wetlands or the example wetlands I'm looking at, we'll see, we'll talk about the specific threats to certain wetlands. So some of the possibilities are filling and mining. And of course, filling wetlands that are in basins or mining fringe wetlands like Dyke Marsh, for example, can cause very severe problems to wetlands. Development of wetlands or adjacent areas, we have some controls on wetlands development, and there has to be permits issued and whatnot, but nonetheless, development continues and wetlands continue to be taken out by development. And I'll talk a little bit about one recent one that concerned me. Wetlands can be threatened by altered hydrology. So too much water entering a wetland or too little water entering a wetland, as we'll see, can cause problems. Pollution, everything from oil spills, sewage, fertilizers, industrial waste, sediment. So some wetlands need some sediment. They can take some sediment, but too much sediment can destroy them. Sea level rise. So we'll see that some wetlands in our area the erosion rate has been drastically increased by sea level rise. Land subsidence. So these are two different things. And land subsidence occurs usually when groundwater is pumped out below ground at high rates, and there's not as much to hold the land up, it will gradually subside. And in some places, this, along with sea level rise, just doubles the problem for coastal wetlands. Invasive species are often a problem, come in and take over everything from nutria. Beavers are invasive, but they tend to be, they can be native, but they can still be invasive. To plants, purple loosestrife, for example. Storm erosion certainly has caused damage to Dyke Marsh, and climate change we'll see, can affect wetlands, both the hydrology, but also the function. Okay, so I've got some sample wetlands here that I wanted to talk about, and I decided to start with Dyke Marsh, and this gave me the opportunity to review some of the documents on Dyke Marsh and then bring that to you here. So Dyke Marsh is a wetland that has existed for a while, several thousand years. I think there was some revision of that in when the studies were done for the restoration, and it turned out it hadn't been around quite as long as people thought, but it has certainly developed slowly and gradually over time. And the picture on the left was in 1937. You can see three tidal creeks, one here, and one here. And they have the typical tidal creek pattern in which it's a kind of, even though the water is coming in and out, it still has a dendritic pattern of a watershed. So it was a pretty well-developed wetland at that point, but over time, it has, as you know, been severely impacted. The first thing that was impacted, it was dredging and mining of material. Apparently, a contract was already in place on it when it was given to the Park Service, and that went on for 30 years until I guess the mid-'80s, and left the creeks were severely damaged. The northern one was basically almost obliterated, and mainly the southern one was the one left. And then over time since then, which is a little bit behind the panel here, this was a fairly up-to-date picture over here. There's been further damage, and this has brought on, though, finally the studies and the work that's going on out there to create, I guess, a barrier or something to decrease the wave action, because once the marsh was degraded, it became much more susceptible to wave action from the south, from storms, and that made it even more vulnerable. Okay, so one thing I wanted to bring to your attention, because it's a really useful tool that, let's see if that, okay, is the wetland mapper. And you can go to it at this website, and you can get fairly detailed views of any part of the country in terms of the extent of the wetlands and what types of wetlands. Now they use the Cowardin et al. Classification, but they've modified it a little bit. So the names here don't respond exactly to that. But here's a sample from Huntley Meadows, Dyke Marsh, and Little Hunting Creek. And you can see the main classifications within this are freshwater emergent, which is the light green that occurs along these tidal creeks. two tidal creeks and also in the non-tidal Huntley Meadows. So that would be herbaceous emergence like cattail. And then you have freshwater forested shrub wetland, which is also overlapping with that quite a bit. And so some areas are more open, like a grassy marsh, and some are more closed, like a shrubby or forested marsh. But you can see where the extent of these wetlands in any area in the country. One thing that's interesting on this one, riverine is actually, so in this case, even though the Potomac is tidal in this area, they call it riverine within their classification. You get a little further down river and it's estuarine and marine deep water. So it's just a little bit of a quirk in my opinion. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about several wetlands that are substantial in area and that are valuable and that have issues that cause us to worry about them. So Blackwater National Wildlife Refuge is located over on in Maryland on the Eastern Shore, south of the city of Cambridge, and it has, according to this website, 1/3 of Maryland's tidal wetlands. But the refuge itself contains about 27,000 acres. There's a combination of brackish water marshes and tidal freshwater. Now, some freshwater impoundments which were in place, they were thought to be better for waterfowl. And then there's some non-wetland area in there as well. The refuge is a Ramsar wetland of international importance and a priority wetland for the North American Waterfowl Management Plan. But it's had some impacts. So since the 1930s, over 8,000 acres of marsh have been lost at Blackwater. That's a rate of about 150 acres lost per year, and it's very steady. It just keeps going on and losing acreage. And here the causes of marsh loss include sea level rise, erosion, subsidence, saltwater intrusion, and invasive species. Notice that sea level rise and subsidence are both there. And the net result of that is a lowering, that more of what used to be out of the water is now under the water or along the shore. And that has been part of the increase in the erosion. They also have invasive species there, including nutria and Phragmites. And interestingly, I found that they were one of the main sources of the Underground Railroad, or one of the main stops on the Underground Railroad, which certainly is a topical thing given our what's going on in our country right now. Another wetland complex that's very large and important is Canaan Valley. And Canaan Valley is a 14-mile by 3-mile area that contains an expansive and unique wetland complex. These are the types of wetlands that you would normally find in Canada or in New England. They're actually sphagnum bogs there, and a lot of species that the wetland itself is perched in a perched valley about 3,000 feet above sea level. And about 60% of the valley is protected as part of the National Wildlife Refuge. Okay, and this shows, using the mapper, you can see this is the whole refuge here, and you can see the wetlands are kind of concentrated in certain areas. You've probably heard of Dolly Sods. Maybe that's one of the main wetlands there. And sod, it was given that name because of the distinct nature of the wetland soil there. And again, it's a mixture of emergent and shrub forested wetlands. Some of the threats to Canaan Valley include atmospheric deposition of nitrogen and other pollutants because of the coal burning in the Ohio Valley. The wind will blow nitrogen and sulfur over. There's also from automobile exhaust. Potentially climate change may warm this area up some, and that would make it difficult for the current flora and fauna to prosper. There's not a lot of data on this yet, but it's a possibility. They did note wastewater increase from recreational development. Apparently Dolly Sods was used as a bombing area, practice area during various wars. And so there's still the possibility and the probability of some unexploded ordnance there in Dolly Sods. And they don't actually know much about where it might be. So it's a little bit of a interesting problem. There was extensive mining, and also there was a lot of tree harvesting from this area decades ago, but there's still residual land disturbance from that. What I was able to find out, they didn't really feel that invasive species was much of a problem in Canaan Valley. Okay, so Great Dismal Swamp is another notable wetland in the Mid-Atlantic, and it covers part of the coastal plain of southeastern Virginia and northeastern North Carolina, and it contains Virginia's largest natural lake, Lake Drummond, which is the blue area in the center of the green area. In fact, Lake Drummond is now the only natural lake of any size in Virginia, because Mountain Lake, which was the other major natural lake, had sprang a leak basically, and the water drained out. So in the past 30 years, it has essentially drained out completely. So if we're looking for natural lakes in Virginia, you've got one, Lake Drummond. And then the area around it is mostly freshwater forested wetlands with a little bit of freshwater emergent wetlands just south. Species of note include typical swamp species that you might find further south, called like ball cypress, water tupelo, Atlantic white cedar, and black gum. And even at this low elevation, there's also a sphagnum bog due to the acidic nature of the soils there. Some of the problems, some of the threats to the Great Dismal Swamp have been drainage. That was an early attempt to do some drainage, and some drainage was accomplished along the edges to do agriculture. Logging certainly went on. One of the things that's happened, and then drainage and development have altered the water supply to the swamp. So that and periodic droughts and the water table has gone down, and the peat, which accumulated, peat is the partially decomposed organic matter that sits in the bottom of a wetland, has been exposed to drying, and that has led to fires. So in 2008 and 2011, there were major peat fires, which took months to extinguish. And there's been some tree loss in storms due to the lower water level. Sediment and pollution inflow are damaging the lake. So there, it is still, it is intact, but is not without its problems. Another one, so I wanted to bring in an estuarine or salt marsh type of wetland, and that would be Prime Hook National Wildlife Refuge in Delaware. it's about 10,000 acres of important coastal and upland habitat for migratory birds. It's located on the Atlantic Flyway and can host up to 100,000 snow geese during fall migration. It includes 4,200 acres of freshwater marsh. And this was not freshwater tidal marsh. I think this is freshwater impounded marsh. And then 23 acres of tidal marsh, most of which was salt marsh. It has a large population of spawning horseshoe crabs, which are very interesting crustaceans that evolved, very long time ago, and are actually a source of some. Their blood is a source of some biomedical compounds. So prime hook has a preponderance of estuarine over freshwater wetlands. So if you look in this diagram, you'll see a lot of bluish wetland areas inside the barrier island, and then farther to the west, you'll see some freshwater wetlands. Okay, I note some. Okay, so what are some of the threats here? For several decades, more than 4,000 acres at Prime Hook were maintained as a freshwater habitat. And so this was where the freshwater impounded areas were, but they've kind of rethought that, and now they're restoring, they're taking the impoundments out, and they're allowing the tides to come in. And these are marshes, but they're becoming brackish marshes, and they're managing them in a more natural way. And on the right, you see some of the other information about the new management strategy there. Okay, so I wanted to kind of wrap up this overview with a personal story, but I think it's very, it ends in a personal story. We, of course, live in an urban, suburban area, and has been areas that have been developed over many years, but now we've entered a phase of infill development. And I think both the overall development, which was done earlier on under non-ideal conditions as far as wetland preservation, but also the infill development, have the threat of taking out our few remaining suburban wetlands. And some of the things that happen, in addition to just encroaching on them, is actually piping the small streams, and then just putting a house over the piped area, or having lawns now cover the area that used to be the headwaters of a stream. Now, Virginia's Chesapeake Bay Act Resource Protection Area designation should prevent this, but there are local jurisdictions can have these waived. I'm looking, okay, all right. So I recently participated in an effort to enforce the Resource Protection Act status on some headwater areas of Accotink Creek and Fairfax City. And the city proposed to underground the stream in a pipe and eliminate the RPA. This seemed, well, first of all, unwise, unenvironmental, but also, like, can you really do that? The stream was a functioning ecosystem, had a forest along its riparian area, and quite a few people raised concerns about this. But this development had sort of been in the works for a while, and despite the our efforts to educate the city council, they approved the project, which buried the headwaters of Acatink Creek and eliminated a large resource protection area, which I thought, oh, I mean, I've heard of people encroaching on a resource protection area. I've never heard of anyone legally eliminating one. To illustrate this a little bit further, I went to the wetlands mapper, and I took a representative area of central Fairfax County, which you can see on this map, and just got kind of a synoptic view, kind of a whole area view of how many wetlands are along our streams, how many wetlands are left in this area. And by the way, that circled area with the red circle, that's the part of Acatink Creek that's been put underground or channelized. Some of it was already channelized. So just to give you a little perspective. So if you look at this, you see not a whole lot of green, right? You see a little bit of green along some of the, and probably if we blew it up enough, you'd see a little bit of the light green along streams, but it's really limited. It's really limited. And so I thought, well, how would that compare? Is there some way we can see what that was like, let's say 50 years ago? And I'm not aware of any historic data of this scale for Fairfax County, but I thought, you know, what if we look in a similar area that hasn't been as well developed? So I went to Western Prince William County, and I want you to note the amount of green on this Fairfax map and this exact same scale in a Western Prince William. See what you think. To me, it's overwhelming, the amount of wetland that exists in this less developed area than in the more developed area. And this is both areas are in the Piedmont. They have similar geological characteristics and histories, but this is a much less developed area. The city of Manassas would be in the upper right-hand corner here. So, and you can see Catlett down there at the bottom. So I just, you know, have to wonder whether we're actually doing a good job of maintaining our urban and suburban small wetland areas along streams. Not that we're not trying, not that there's not some effort being made, but is it being successful? Okay, so that's pretty much my wetlands talk. And maybe now would be a good time to stop and see if anyone has any questions about that or comments. And then I wanted to tell you a little bit about our new center. I'm not sure, I can't tell whether has anyone raised their hand or.
So Chris, we do have a couple questions in chat. One, I know you can't see it. Would you like me to read it to you?
Yes.
Sure. One said, you mentioned the carbon sequestration. Fairfax County is in the process of setting goals for carbon reductions for the next 30 years. Compared to other carbon reduction strategies, how effective is wetland creation or restoration? How large of an area would need to be created or restored to achieve measurable results? And one last part, would saving RPA areas and or restoring streamways also count towards carbon reduction?
Yeah, very good question. And it would get into the extent of that you could pull off. I would say that that saving a wetland is going to yield immediate. You've already got the carbon sequestered there. It's not going to increase carbon sequestration, but it's going to keep it from being released, because once you, depending on how the wetland was developed, the carbon might or might not be sequestered, but I would say might or might not be released. But I would say that preservation and management of existing wetlands would be the best strategy. Creating new wetlands is fine. It takes a long time to build up the peat in the soils. So it's not going to yield immediate returns, but certainly is going to help over time, even that. So I would say it should be considered, and you'd have to run the numbers to see if it was, how important it was.
Follow-up to that question was, can you repeat who made the decision to drain out the wetlands in Fairfax and make it into a pipe?
That was the city council of Fairfax City. So it was in the city of Fairfax where I happen to live. And there, I saw correspondence between the city and DEQ, and DEQ said, one person at DEQ said you can't do that, but apparently he was not the, he or she was not the final word. I don't know whether the state can actually overrule the city. It may be that the law is written such that the city has a certain amount of discretion in that, but it was disappointing.
Another question is, what are some ways we can get involved to study and protect our wetlands?
Okay, well, we've got several organizations represented here, which I think are probably really good groups as far as helping to protect and probably studying. I'm not, I haven't thought through other groups, but there's a lot of, so there's site-specific groups like Friends of various wetland areas, and then there's we don't offer much in the way of continuing ed courses at this point at our center, so we don't really have much to help you with that, but yeah, that's about all I can offer.
Another question on that was, what arguments could we make to use with the Fairfax City Council that might work with them to educate them? And also, if it was reversed, would the wetlands return?
Mm-hmm. Well, I pride myself in having made some pretty good arguments to them, and there were others. There were citizens many citizens made those arguments. I think probably the most important thing is, and this is something that I'm not particularly good at, but is to monitor the activities of the local jurisdictions with regards to development and kind of wave the flag early in the process, because what happens is these things get a certain amount of impetus behind them, and there's buy-in from the local governments for these developments. I mean, one of the things was, oh, this is going to be great senior housing and we don't have much in the city, you know. Of course, our point was, okay, go back and move the building a little bit so it's not sitting on top of the stream. But so I would say involvement in your local planning processes at an early stage is very important.
And this project is already complete, is that correct? Someone was asking about a lawsuit. Yeah.
Yeah, it's not complete. It's not even started, but it's met all its approvals. So yeah, you people may be familiar with the Audubon Naturalist Society, and they got very much behind this education effort, shall we say, and you know, concern. And there was they, you know, explored the idea of a lawsuit. I think it wasn't clear. It wasn't clear that a lawsuit would actually. I brought it to the attention of my delegate, David Bulova, and I was hoping that he would like get DEQ to put the, to really be tough about it. But he demurred, I would have to say. So I don't know if our politicians aren't willing to stand up for our law, for our regulations. Yeah, a lawsuit might possibly work.
Someone wants to know what a nutria is.
Well, it's a beaver type of animal. It's a mammal, semi-aquatic mammal, which was introduced into the United States from South America, and for fur pelt purposes, and of course, like most invasive species, it spread out of control, and yeah, people were actually commercially raising them at a certain point in time, but yeah, that's what a nutria is.
Next question is, could you, I'm going to try and go in order. What extent can Dyke Marsh be built up with dredge spoils, with cribs or other structures to contain the edges or compensate subsidence and sea level with top dressing with dredge spoils?
I am. I'm not overly familiar with the Dyke Marsh plan. My main understanding is they're building a jetty to knock down the force of the wind, the force of the waves from the south. I don't know to what extent they're planning on nourishing the marsh versus just eliminating the erosion.
Next question is, can you suggest some other readings to learn more about these subjects?
That I'm more familiar. So there's the technical reports that I cited in here, Cowardin and the hydrogeomorphic, and I'd be happy to send those references. Wetlands, there is a man named William Mitch, M-I-T-S-C-H, that's written the standard textbook on wetlands, which would certainly be a good reference, and if you or good reference for people. I'm not as familiar with more popularly oriented books about wetlands.
And if people want to ask their questions themselves, you're welcome to do so. You can raise your hand, or you can unmute yourself one at a time to ask. Or you can continue to go through chat. That's fine too. Oh, here's a question in the chat. The exotic invasive plants in Dyke Marsh seem to be taking over, especially clematis and porcelainberry. What hope do we have to beat them back?
Mm-hmm. Well, one thing we know about invasive plants is that and invasive organisms in general is once they get established, it is a very difficult process of managing them is probably about all you can do. So I think you have to be vigilant, and you just have to assume that you're going to have to devote resources continually for that. There may be species that you can eliminate locally, but a lot of those can seed back in too from birds and whatnot. So I think, unfortunately, part of it is just continued vigilance once they're in there. I know that's a very general answer, but that's been my experience with generally with invasive species. They're hard to eliminate.
Can you talk about some of the research you're doing at your center?
Yeah, maybe would it be okay to go forward with a few slides about the
Oh,
center?
yes,
Yeah.
yes, yes.
Okay, why don't we do that? And then that will lead me to the research. Okay, so let's see, I want to go page down. Okay, so here's our new center building on the Potomac. This is down on the tidal Occoquan. So you go just into Prince William County, and it's in a development called Belmont Bay Development. It's just downstream from all the bridges over the Occoquan. It's a 50,000 square foot facility. It has the main tenant of the facility is called Potomac Science Center. The main tenant is my research and education center called Potomac Environmental Research and Education Center, or PERIC for short. So the mission that I set out in about 15 years ago when we first started trying to get this in place was to utilize the tools of scientific research, restoration, education, and policy analysis to help society understand and sustain natural processes in ecosystems, watersheds, and landscape. So sort of a pretty large purview. And after a number of years of trying to get a facility on the river, we actually got funded by the legislature, George Mason, for this building. And it opened in 2018. And this shows you where it is in relation to, Dyke Marsh is in this area here, Alexandria, here's Fairfax for the main GMU campus. And then this is in Woodbridge, it looks out on Mason Neck. We have a great view. We look out on Mason Neck. We have 8 researchers there professors that are engaged in research along with their graduate students and undergraduates. We have some teaching lab space. We have sport rooms. We have have a presence in K-12 education. Part of that is that we actually have a laboratory that can seat 30 K-12 students. So a teacher could conceivably bring their whole class out and do some work there. We also have a lot of outdoor K-12 teaching, something called the Meaningful Watershed Education Experience program that we've been doing for longer than we've had the building. Let me just tell you what some of our main, here's our link to our website. The longest running study that we've have is a almost 40-year study of the ecological analysis of Gunston Cove, which started off back when there were massive blue-green algal blooms in the Potomac that seemed to emanate from Gunston Cove and other areas. So that's been an annual study funded by the Fairfax County for the last, well, it started in 1984. So every year since then. We have a similar, but actually even more extensive project that's been going on for about 8 years with Alexandria Renew Enterprises up in Little Hunting Creek, or I'm sorry, and Hunting Creek, and looking at the effects of the Alex Renew treatment plant, and more recently at trying to document the monitoring to document the effectiveness of the CSO project, where they're basically trying to eliminate combined sewer overflows by building these underground storage tunnels. And each one of these studies goes from everything from water quality to fish. So we've assembled quite a nice database of Virginia Potomac ecosystems. Other faculty there study harmful algal blooms. They study they study more estuarine bivalves. We're doing stuff on stormwater ponds. How effective are they in pollutant removal? And recently, we've discovered some cyanobacteria growing down in the SAV beds, the weed beds across from our facility, and we're trying to determine if they're, how are they interfering with the ecosystem? Do they have toxins? So I have a student working on that. So those are some of the kinds of things that we work on there. And again, it's mostly, I mean, we want to have more community and K-12 programs, but the university itself does not have much money for that. So, that's been sort of on the back burner so far. The building is open from 9 to 5 daily. It's got a beautiful view. There's a few exhibits in it, but not nearly as many as we want. So it would be mainly going to some place where you could have a nice view of the river and see a few exhibits, but not, it's not a Smithsonian museum by any stretch. So, thank you for hosting me tonight, and I hope I've, been informative and instructive, and maybe cause people to think a little bit and worry a little bit about our wetlands. And thank you for the opportunity to tell you about our center.
Do you have time for a few more questions?
Sure.
So one question was, would you be willing to make your presentation available to participants? Yeah, we got a lot of compliments and a lot of requests for your presentation.
And I think I'm willing. I think you're recording it.
We are.
And then also I sent you the PowerPoint. So I'm more than happy for you to pass that on to the group.
Okay, great. Thank you. Someone else wanted to know, they said a few years ago, Dr. Kim de Mutzert gave a talk on, and they want to know if the work that she's doing on water quality in Hunting Creek is still ongoing.
Oh yeah. Yeah, that's part of the Hunting Creek study. So I'm the PI, meaning I'm the chief of the study, but she's in charge of the fish work. And one of the things that she discovered was there were actually river herring spawning in Cameron Run, which everyone had written off as, are you kidding me, sort of thing. So even in some of our more impacted urban streams, there can be important life going on there. Yeah, so she's very much active with us on that.
The next question is, we've seen a huge swing in hydrilla populations in the Potomac over the years. Do you know what causes these swings?
Okay, so my experience I'm going to draw a little bit on my experience in Hunting Creek since 2013. When we first started working there, it was chock full of hydrilla and all sorts of other, some native, some introduced wetland species. And, but in 2018, when we had that very wet summer, there was a lot of scouring so there's a lot of potential water input into Hunting Creek via Cameron Run and other streams, and it just tore it out. The best I can tell, it tore out the SAV and flushed it down river. and it hasn't come back yet. There wasn't much there. On the other hand, down where we are, down in the Occoquan, there wasn't as much of a as much impact of those storms, and we've got super lush hydrilla and other species beds there. So there is some climatic effect. I know also, though, that there were some cases where, like Blue Plains, there was a big bed, and it's come and gone several times, I believe. So some of them are more mysterious. I don't know exactly why some of this occurs. Hydrilla does not have a lot of rootstock, so it's not like, so something like water celery has a lot of rootstock, so it's going to tend to come back in the same place. Water lilies have huge underground rhizomes. They're going to come back year after year in the same places. But hydrilla is, and another one is a native plant called ceratophyllum or coontail, which doesn't even root. It just it hangs in the water column. So it's easy to wash out too. So I don't have the answer for all of that.
As a follow-up to that, do you have a lot of hydrilla down by Potomac this year?
Oh yeah, it's chock full. It looks like you could, at low tide, it looks like dry land, like it's a, you know, a meadow for cows to eat. I was just looking at that at low tide today, and it was just unbelievable, you know. And so it's not consistent from one place to another, and even in the same year.
Next question is, are you interested in studying microplastics in the Potomac River? And if you had funding, would you?
We actually do have some of our members, some of our faculty are doing some microplastics studies. Some of it's student driven and some of it is grant driven. And so we're doing it mainly down around the center just because it's easier to get in and out. But yeah, we are definitely interested in that and have pursued it at some level. We don't have as much funding for that as for other things.
And that's all the questions we have in the chat right now. Oh, there's one more.
Last question.
Last question. Last call. This is it.
Yeah. Okay.
Are there any further professional training or coursework programs in the work of PERC and wetland delineation, perhaps?
Yeah, we don't have anything. We know that's an area that there is a lot of demand for. There are short courses and whatnot offered by various people, various institutions, and even wetlands groups or whatever that are available. But we have not, the only continuing education type, the only course in that vein that I've offered, and nobody else has offered any, is algal identification for water professionals. So I've offered a week-long courses in training to identify different species of algae, particularly problematic ones. And we'd like to do more things like that. It's just you have to set up a program. You have to have some infrastructure, and you have to have a faculty member who's really motivated to do it too. So, all right. Well, thank you very much. I've enjoyed my time with you, and
Thank you.
feel free to give my email out, etc., along with the presentations.
Thank you.
Okay.
And we have a lot of thank yous in the chat to you as well.
Okay, wonderful. All right, well, I feel very appreciated then. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm gonna stop share. and
Thank
then-
you, Chris.
Okay, take care, everyone. See you later. I'm leaving.
Okay. Thank you everybody for coming tonight. Glenda, any last messages, or shall we sign off for everyone? Okay, we'll end for all then. Thank you again for coming, everyone.